We're on. Good to see you. I appreciate it. We have a good crowd that has returned for our service this evening. And I thank you, and I know the Lord is pleased about that when people put Him first in their lives. It's a marvelous thing. Let me make a couple of announcements to you. You mentioned a couple of things. I hope you've met Kim's mom, Jean McAfee. She told me before services that when she can't get to services, she watches our program. And so those of you who are involved in live streaming, I want you to know how important that is to some folks. And she watches our program and comments about it, and I think that's marvelous. She and her late husband have been marvelous benefactors to this congregation over the years, especially our young people. They have supported them in marvelous ways, and I thank you, Jean, and it's good to see you and glad to have you here. And I want you to know that you're welcome to stay no matter what Kim says. Okay? Also, on Sunday mornings this next year, we're starting a new study. I thank our brother Brian for taking us through some Old Testament books. He is always willing and ready to teach, and I appreciate that, Brian, very much. We're going to be studying through Acts. You say, oh my, we've studied through Acts 100 times. Well, we're going to do it a little differently this time. Different men in the congregation are going to teach the class for a month. And first, and you can make whatever judgment you want to as to why he's first, but first is Chris Bridwell. And then I think John has February, and we will be letting you know who will teach the other months. But this does a couple of things. One, it gives our men opportunities to teach. There are lots of our guys who don't want to just take it on forever and ever and ever. But they say, I'll teach a month. That's 4 weeks, sometimes 5 weeks, and I'll do that much. And I appreciate that a great deal. And also, it just gives us a new, fresh look at a marvelous book in the New Testament, the book of Acts, which is a book of conversions and tells us a great deal about the establishment of the church. So mark that down and plan to be here for Bible study. Kirk said to me, he heard me say something, said, are you going to talk about Christmas again? Well, I don't remember talking about it the first time, but you know me. But yes, I am going to talk about it. And here's the reason. At this time of the year, there are so many divergent views about Christmas and our involvement in it. And people can get rather excited about it. I am Facebook friends with a preacher from India. And we would have said back where I came from, he was ed up with it. He is eaten up with this idea of not observing Christmas in any way, not even saying the word, because it is an instrument of Satan, and there's nothing good to be said about it, and it's sinful for us to preach about it, talk about it, celebrate it in any way. And there's that viewpoint. And I will tell you that when I grew up many, many years ago, that was pretty much the prevailing opinion in the church. What often happens is that we go from one extreme to the other extreme. In trying to get away from one extreme, we just go right into the other one. And so now we have churches who want to celebrate Christmas full bore, and they want to have nativity scenes and singing Christmas trees and singing happy birthday to Jesus and telling everybody that December the 25th is Jesus' birthday. Well, I think that's a ditch on the other side. And I often tell people that the truth is between the extremes to which it has been miscarried. So what I want us to do is to talk about some moderation. I want us to talk about some positive things and a few negative things so that we can come away with a healthy view, a biblical view, of this idea of Christmas as to whether it relates to Christ's birthday or not. Much we cannot know. And much of what we think we know, we get wrong. Now, here's what I know. I know that Jesus Christ was born. I know that because Matthew and Luke tell me so. And I know that Matthew quotes Isaiah's prophecy from Isaiah 7:14. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bring forth a son. Thou shalt call his name Emmanuel. Now, if you're wondering who Isaiah is talking about, read Matthew's account of the birth of Jesus, because he says this is what the prophet was talking about. I'll take Matthew's word for it. How about you? That he knew what he was talking about. I also know that Jesus, by fulfillment of prophecy, was born in Bethlehem. In Micah chapter 5 and verse 2, Micah says, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, yet out of you shall come the one who shall be ruler of Israel, whose goings forth are from of ancient times. And so Micah not only knew that Jesus would be born, but he knew that he would be born in Bethlehem. And so I put some prophecy together, and I put Matthew's account and Luke's account together, and I come away with the idea, yeah, Jesus was born. I can't deny that. That ought to be significant to us. John would say, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. And so the birth of Jesus ought to be important to us. If I had to pick out a verse that tells me more than most verses about the birth of Jesus, I would choose Galatians chapter 4 and verse 4. Paul wrote, when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem those who were under the law. Now that little verse tells us a great deal. The fullness of time. Wonder what was wrapped up in all of that. Wonder what God had in mind when he said the fullness of time. We can guess at some things. Perhaps it was Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. The world for a while was pretty peaceable. And Rome made it that way with the sword. But that made it easier for people to travel. Judaism had gone out across the world, and that meant that people were exposed to God. The idea that there is Jehovah, that he is the Father of all creation. And so people were beginning to get an idea of something about divinity, something about religion. And furthermore, we had a universal language, Koine Greek. Well, if you're going to take the gospel, it makes sense that it's easier to do so if everybody speaks the same language. And the language of the day, although people spoke other languages, the world language was Greek, Koine Greek. Like today, it is English. People speak other languages, but if you study a foreign language in a foreign country, you study English. And lots of people, sad to say, can speak English better than some of us who grew up trying to speak it. And so there were lots of things that had come together. And it was the fullness of time according to God. He said, it's time. I've often thought, what if years before Jesus had been born? And he had said, I am Jesus, I am the Son of God. And they would have said, who's God? And he had said, I have come to save you from your sins. And they would have said, what's a sin? And he would have said, I want you to go to heaven when you die. And they would have said, where's heaven? What's heaven? It took time for the world to be developed, the fullness of time for God to send His Son. He was born under the law of Moses. And He was born so that people could be saved. He was born of woman, uniquely of woman. You say, well, we all were, weren't we? Well, yes, we share that as a part of mankind. We were born of a woman, but uniquely, He was born of woman, that virgin of Isaiah 7:14, who would bring forth a son, and they would call His name Emmanuel. So there are some things I know. It amuses me, some things we think we know. For instance, we are pretty sure that there were 3 wise men. The Bible frankly does not say. We come upon the idea of 3 wise men because they brought 3 gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh, and we put 2 and 2 together and come up with 3. We assume that each one brought a gift, and therefore there were 3 wise men. I don't know whether there were 3 or 30 or just 2. I know they brought 3 gifts. And in every nativity scene you see them at the manger. Well, friends, the wise men never went to the manger. By the time that they got to Bethlehem, Jesus was already in a house. You can read that in Matthew chapter 2 and verse 11. He was 2 or a little shy of 2. Remember that Herod wanted all the male babies under 2 years old to be killed. And the reason was he was afraid this new king would take his place. And so let's just kill them all and we'll get the right one. And he went to 2 years old. What does that tell you? That Jesus was no longer the babe in a manger. We have all kinds of pictures in our heads of the manger. And we see a little shed and there are animals around and Jesus is in a feeding box of some sort. Probably, although we can't be sure, he was in the lower level of a house. Can you believe it? That the animals were often kept on the first floor of the house. And they were kept there for 2 reasons. First of all, for safety for them. And secondly, for warmth. Now, I know that most of us would not like to live on second floor when the ground level had all kinds of animals on it. Brian gave us quite a treatise this morning on the fact that pigs don't smell very good. And so if you had had pigs down there and some other animals, I don't know that I'd want to be on the second floor. But remember, we are living in America in the 21st century. We're not in Palestine in the first century. And things were more than a little different at that time. So it may be that that's where he was. I don't know. But I do know that the wise men never went to the manger. Folks, if those things were important to us, if God really wanted us to know those kind of things, don't you think He probably would have told us? I'm of the opinion that God tells us what we need to know. And I just have to leave it at that. And so I can have a picture in my mind, but it may not be the correct picture because my picture may be based upon things I've seen or things I've heard and not on the biblical account. Extremism begets extremism. When I moved to the first place I preached, many, many years ago, there was a family there who did not believe in celebrating Christmas in any way. They had 2 daughters. And of course, as those daughters got a little older, they didn't like the fact that everybody else got presents and they didn't. So their parents took them shopping the week before Christmas and bought them non-presents, non-wrapped, non-Christmassy, but presents. And even as a young preacher, I thought, there's something straight up strange about that. And more than a little hypocritical. That you think you buy it the week before, you don't wrap it, you don't call it a Christmas present, so it's okay. But I grew up with that kind of mentality. There is no example in Scripture of anybody celebrating the birthday of Jesus in a special way. There's no command to do it. There's no verse that says, thou shalt have a special day to mark the birthday of Jesus. And there's no example of anybody doing it. Now, what we do have is we have a command to remember His death. And people who do not like the idea of Christmas are quick to remind us of that. They tell us what we are to celebrate is His death, and that's right. 1 Corinthians 11. And we often read that before the Lord's Supper, that Jesus left commands that people were to observe the bread in memory of His body and the fruit of the vine in memory of His shed blood. And that we are to do that on the first day of the week, and that the Corinthian church came together to do that. We have a divine command and example for that to be done. And so many people say, since we have no divine command, and since we have no example, it is a sinful thing for us to celebrate Christmas in any way. And they go to the point that they do not even say Merry Christmas, it's Happy Holidays. That kind of gets you off the hook, doesn't it? As if that change of verbiage makes everything okay. And they point out that Christmas does have Catholic and pagan influences. Can't deny that. If you read the history of Christmas, it goes back to about the 4th century. It grew up around what we know as the winter solstice. That's the time of the year right now when we have the longest dark and the shortest light. But that means one thing. It means things are going to get better. That we're going to have less dark and more light. And so people would celebrate. And they would burn logs. And they would put decorations on trees. And they would not work. And they had festive activities, including mistletoe, by the way. Mistletoe goes back a long way. And so when somebody says, a lot of what we know as Christmas today, the trappings, go back to Catholic and pagan origins. And that's right. I've often wondered about those people, how they say the names of our months or the names of our days. Don't you know that January, which is coming, is named after a Roman god, Janus, who was rather strange, was two-faced. With one face looked back and one face looked forward. Was the god of gates and beginnings. So I guess we're going to have to quit saying January. And Thursday has something to do with that god Thor. So we're going to have to change the name Thursday. Do you see what I'm saying? If we were to undo or try to undo everything that in the past has some smacking of a pagan origin, we're in big trouble. And I'm not even going to try to do that. Because nobody thinks about that today. Unless somebody points that out to you. I'm guessing you don't think about it. I'm guessing that's not on your radar. But it is a truth. Now, what about a middle ground? I like to tell you about experiences I've had because the only experiences I've had are the ones I've had. They're mine. And so let me tell you about sitting in a college classroom many years ago. The professor was a very good man, a very wise, very smart man. He was not the most exciting lecturer I ever heard. As a matter of fact, some days it was a little hard to stay awake. And this was one of those days, and we were studying the book of Romans. And we came to chapter 14. And he read the passage that I want to read to you, verses 5 and 6 in Romans 14. And I will tell you, this has done more to shape my thinking than probably anything else relative to the subject. Romans 14, 5 and 6. One person esteems one day above another. Another esteems every day alike. Let each be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it to the Lord. And he who does not observe the day, to the Lord he does not observe it. He who eats, eats to the Lord, for he gives God thanks. And he who does not eat, to the Lord he does not eat, and gives God thanks. He read that passage and he stopped. And I thought, okay. He said, I've got a couple of questions. He said, what did Paul mean in the context there? And we talked about some of the things that people had been caught up, the trappings of Judaism. And that they had special days in Judaism. And some of the people who came out of Judaism and became Christians still celebrated those days because they were a part of their Jewish heritage. And others would not. And some would eat meat that had been offered to idols, thinking nothing of it. And others could not eat that meat offered to idols, thinking only that it had once been on an idol's altar. And he said, that's right. He said, I have another question. He says, what's the application of that for us today? Say to Christmas. And I heard the Christmas word. And I perked right up and I thought, what? This esteemed Bible scholar said Christmas and asked us to think about it relative to Romans 14, 5, and 6. From that day on, I had a new respect for that man. One, he went against the grain. The other, he just opened my mind to some things. I think we would do well as Christians to reread Romans 14. I think we would do well to understand that we do not all have the same scruples. That there are things that are absolutely wrong. There are things that are absolutely right. And people say there's no in-betweens. That's unrealistic. I could ask you a dozen questions tonight that you cannot give me a yes or no answer to. Have you quit beating your wife? Now, you know you're in trouble however you answer that, don't you? If you say no, the implication is you're still beating her. And if you say yes, the implication is that you used to and have quit. There are questions that you can't answer yes or no. Sometimes we have personal scruples. Things that don't fit into the yes, no, right, wrong area. There were people in Rome who could observe feast days, Jewish feast days. Didn't bother them. They could eat meat offered to idols. Didn't bother them. There were others who could not do either. Now here's the problem. We expect people to have our scruples. We expect people to feel exactly how we feel about things, and that's not fair. And therefore, I respect people who disagree with me, although I may think they are absolutely wrong. I had a year or so ago a fellow who was on a tirade against Christmas. And any mention of it, any celebration of it, it was absolutely wrong. You would go to hell. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. And I sent him a little note and said, have you read Romans 14, 5 and 6? And he wrote back, thank you. Which I never knew what that meant. But at least I hope I caused him to think about the situation. Now let me tell you about me. We don't have a Christmas tree this year. I miss it. It's a lot of work to put up a Christmas tree. And when both of us, my wife and I, are crippled up, we're not inclined to put one up. We just pretend there's one. But I've had Christmas trees. I love the giving and exchanging of gifts. I love nearly everything about Christmas. I love the music of Christmas. I think what we call Christmas carols are some of the most beautiful songs that we know. But God forbid that around December the 25th we sing one of them in church, because the roof would cave in if we would. And we can't see any sense in singing one July. And so you know what we don't do? We just don't sing them. And we leave some marvelous, marvelous, marvelous songs unsung. I like the joy, the happiness of Christmas. I like to hear people saying, Merry Christmas. Today at lunch, one of the fellows I used to have as a student in school was there with some of the members where he preaches in a little congregation out here. And he came over and he made a big point of telling me that he also watches our program, and he wanted to wish me a happy birthday or a Merry Christmas. And when we left, I wished him a Merry Christmas. And I just think I like that. I do not personally associate Christmas with the birth of Jesus. If your Christmas cards have a nativity scene on them, I'm not going to make the sign of the cross and condemn you. Not at all. I was in a member's house. The man was a deacon. He had a beautiful Christmas tree. He had this gorgeous nativity scene around the base of it. And he said, I'm so sorry. I said, his name's Tom, was Tom. I said, Tom, why? He said, well, I didn't want you to see that. I said, it's beautiful. He said, it's been in my family. And he told me how many years, I don't remember. And he said, it's just not Christmas if I don't put that up. I said, bless you. It's beautiful. I will tell you, if you'll not tell it on me, we have a nativity scene at our house. It's in one of our curio cabinets behind the couch. We don't bring it out and put a spotlight on it, but we have one. And so I want you to know your scruples may not be my scruples. I oppose error. When somebody says Jesus was born on December the 25th, I said, you need to rethink that. When somebody wants to sing Happy Birthday, Jesus, other than thinking that's cheesy, I just want to say, I think you need to rethink that. When somebody wants to say, we must do this relative to Christmas, I want to say, I think you need to rethink that. On the other hand, when somebody says, don't say the word, it's Happy Holidays, and don't you dare send a Christmas card that has a nativity scene on it, and you're going to be lost if you celebrate Christmas, I'm going to say, you need to rethink that. You need to read Romans 14, 5 and 6. So at least you know how I feel about the matter. And so from my house to yours, Merry Christmas.